Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast. Today we'll be discussing United States history since 1860. Today I will be an interviewee and our guest speaker will be the interviewer.
Hello, my name is Nick Morales, and today I'll be taking the role of an interviewer and asking Flora specific questions regarding this topic. To start off, I want to ask you a general question, Flora. What is American literature, and what have you learned about the American concerns, culture, and values?
Well, I've honestly learned so much about the history of the United States. Every reading and material presented in this course was new and interesting. I believe American literature is anything associated with the United States, obviously, but also work that reveals the truth behind America. In school and in this country, we usually don't hear about the flaws of America and Americans, just the heroic figures and why this country is a dream. With this being said, American literature is concerned with the reality of America and what every human in this country experienced. Evidently, American culture and values were very distinct since the year 1860. It's very intriguing yet astonishing to realize how the values and culture of America all conveyed racism, discrimination, violence, cruelty, and so much more. I say this because of slavery, labor, violence towards different races, and some of the laws. Overall, many of the people we learn about portrayed the flaws that exist in the United States history that many of us have never even heard of. This also plays a role in the identity of this country, as many cold-hearted facts are essentially hidden or have just been forgotten.
I definitely agree with all of your points, Flora. It's shocking to learn about many truths that have been forgotten about American history or American people in general. With that, it's also disappointing to me how many of these things are no longer taught in schools because this information is very critical, sensitive, and highly significant. As a dream country, we have to be able to accept all of the identity that has taken place in the US, especially since many things are now different. In regards to racism, it's shocking to me how much this existed since the year 1860, but it's still going on today. I wonder what people like Susie King Taylor, Baldwin, or Bullison would think. I should ask, what is your take on this specific comment?
I'm glad you actually pointed that out, as it's such a relevant and interesting topic. Personally, I'm shocked to see how racism, discrimination, violence, cruelty, and all of these negative things still go on today. Throughout this course, I reflected so much upon these people's works and their experiences in America to today's world. Honestly, I think these people would be highly disappointed in our country today when it comes to all these negative factors. How is it that ending all of these things has been a fight since before 1860 and they're still going on today? That's mind-blowing to me and frustrating because there has been decades for change and it feels like this year we've gone down the drain with racism and violence.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I believe America still has some similar values and identity as in the year 1860 and after that, which I don't know if that's necessarily bad or good, or maybe both. Anyways, we should move on to the historical timeline you've created for us today. I'm going to ask you to go through each person and just name the book they published and what year.
Yes, of course. So first, I've created this historical timeline, obviously in order. Today we're starting off with Josiah Strong. The book he published was Our Country, Its Possible Future and Its Present Crisis in the year 1885. We then move on to Justice Henry Billings Brown, who published the text Plessy versus Ferguson in the year 1896. Then we have Susie King Taylor, who published her memoir called Reminiscences of My Life in a Camp in African American Women's Civil War Memoir in 1902. Then we have Americo Paredes, who published George Washington Gomez in the year 1940. We then have Carlos Puluzon, who published America is in the Heart in 1943. Vine Jr. Deloria published We Talk, You Listen, New Tribes, New Turf in the year 1970. We then have James Baldwin, who published The Fire Next Time in the year 1963. Then Michael Roy Hames Garcia, who wrote Which America is Ours, Martin's Truth and the Foundation of American Literature in the year 2003. Then we have Moja Kaf, who published The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf in 2006. Jose Antonio Vargas, who published My Life as an Undocumented Immigrant in 2011. Joel Pfister published Surveyors of Customs, American Literature as Cultural Analysis in the year 2015. And finally, we have Paul T. Corrigan, who wrote Threshold Concepts in Literary Studies in the year 2019. Those were our 12 primary authors whose texts we read and also helped us throughout this course when writing and reading.
Thank you for that. I look forward to learning more about these authors and the details from their 12 primary texts. Moving along to the socioeconomic context, I'd like you to elaborate on how economic and political elites consolidated their power between 1865 to 1924 over how marginalized populations experienced 1. Moving from state-sanctioned slavery to freedom from slavery, 2. Crossing over from living or working outside to inside the U.S., and 3. Living in the margins of racial or ethnic, gender, sexual identity, and or religious power and privilege since the Civil War.
Of course. Thank you for transitioning me today. There's a lot to talk about, but I'll try to cover every topic pretty explicitly. So first, I want to explain some of these laws. The U.S. Congress Public Law of 126 states, "It shall not be lawful for any Chinese laborer to come or having so come after the expiration of said 90 days to remain with the United States." This law also states, "No Chinese person shall be permitted to enter the United States by land." Clearly, this law prohibited Chinese people for rights under the United States, portraying racism and segregation. Next, the U.S. Congress Public Law 120 spoke of Indians and Indian tribes. Basically, it said no Indian nation or tribe within the territory of the United States shall be acknowledged or recognized as independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract by treaty. Indians were always made false promises with treaties, and it was tiring because no promise was ever true. This law broke these treaties, which was new to everyone. Next up, we have the Plessy versus Ferguson, was the separate but equal Supreme Court opinion. Blacks would be treated equally, but everything was separated, so basically nobody would interfere or cross paths. Although this was meant for equality, it was clearly never equal. Along with the Chinese, Japanese were also excluded. The early Japanese quest for citizenship began the fight for citizenship and some acknowledgement in the United States. President Theodore Roosevelt was involved and was also part of this quest. This speaks about Ozawa, a Japanese immigrant who was ineligible for citizenship. As stated in the text, this is one of the many events that contributed to their sense of having been reduced to an abandoned people forsaken by both the mother country and the immigrant land. Moreover, Jim Crow laws established these separate but equal regulations. Blacks and white were separated in restrooms, restaurants, schools, and so much more. These laws were a beginning to more violence, racism, cruelty, which kept escalating with powerful leaders such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Strong spoke about racism in a different way. He included God and racism in his novel. He speaks about God and says how Christendom destroyed slavery, which was untrue. Many religious people held slaves captive and beat slaves, which is why I disagree with his statement. His Christian views made him believe that American people were capable of a better place and should not be separate and the way it appeared. Overall, he thought God needed to be more relied on in order to fix the nation's problems. All of these laws again established a theme of falsity in the American dream. Moving on to the next topic, Taylor was born a slave but moved into freedom when given an education and enlisting into the army. Her memoirs offer a different perspective to what it was like being an educated African-American woman in the Civil War. She shows moving from freedom to slavery in the sense of mistreatment and being diverse because of the color of her skin. In her memoir, she says, "They say one flag, one nation, one country, indivisible. Is this true? Can we say this truthfully when one race is allowed to burn, hang, and inflict the most horrible torture weekly, monthly, or another? This is shocking to read because it's the harsh reality. The Founding Fathers promised equality and one nation for all, but that's so untrue, which is clear with all of the surveyors of their experiences. Her movement from freedom to slavery was when she was allowed to leave to Savannah, Georgia, with her grandmother and receive a secretive education. She was fortunate enough to not have a cruel slave owner, which was typical, and she was privileged and special enough to leave and receive an education, even if it was hidden. Bulusana, Paredes, and Vargas all came to America to live an American dream. However, they all came here to work under unsafe and hard conditions. In his writing, Vargas said he lived in fear and knew he was different because of his race in America. He worked a lot because his family came here for a better life, although it wasn't exactly that. Paredes talks about a boy named Gualinto in his novel, in which he shows the mistreatment and what it was like to be a Mexican-American boy in this country. He has insecurities about who he is in America. He has struggles when identifying as Mexican-American because he wanted to remain true to his culture and his mother, which identifies again a hardship of this. Bulusan finally shares his complexity in working and not finding anything more to his life in America. He always had hope in the American dream, even if it was shown differently or had the reason to lose hope in this dream. He experiences of how he still had hope and didn't see anything forward moving on in his life, which portrayed the perspective of what it was like to be a Mexican American in this country. It meant being split up, working from a young age, thinking labor is the only thing to do because of your race, and so much more. This meant living in fear of being separated from your family or being taken back to your immigrant land, being stopped by police because of the color of your skin or because of the way you looked like coming home from work, and so much more. Overall, they, as every other race, had a different type of reality in the United States. Finally, I will elaborate on the third part of this section. All of these surveyors evidently lived through the margins of racial or ethnic gender, sexual identity, and or religious power and privilege since the Civil War. They all experienced life through racial or ethnic problems in their time period. Even today, people of color still experience racism, which isn't shocking to learn how they experience so much of it. Women in particular, as Susie King Taylor, experience more problems as other women due to sexual identity. Women usually had less rights, were seen as nothing, were the housewives, weren't allowed to know how to read and write, and so much more. Yet, she, as other women, had the privilege to become educated, and as she did, she wrote her own memoir. Due to the historical time period, it was fascinating to learn how women wrote and how they shared their experiences, especially Taylor, who was an African-American woman and offered a different perspective to the identity of America. In regards to religious power, Strong offers more of an perspective and general idea to this because of the fact that he believed Christendom ended slavery. In his writing, he shares many points where he involves God and thinks God was the only solution to fixing the nation's problems. However, I disagree as do other peers because of the fact that many people were religious, yet they still were racist, owned slaves and beat them, raped women, and so much more. This shows religious power and also conveys privilege with white people. White supremacy still exists now, but was way bigger back then. Clearly, white people were the only ones who were treated fairly in this country. Their color of skin gave them more privileges in this country, which again made this phrase of the American dream completely false.
Thank you so much for your insightful comments on all three parts. I've never learned about any of these people, but I feel more knowledgeable now with everything you have stated. Now, I'd like to introduce you to the framework and method discussion. Here, you will be speaking about Michael James Garcia and Pfister and their work. After this description, I want you to explain how you utilize both of their methods in studies of American literature.
Okay, so first I want to point out that both of their work has helped me so much throughout this course. I had never even heard of these techniques or methods which I believe are very important and should be referenced more. I will start with James Garcia. He wrote about the civic duty of the culture critic. In his writing, he speaks about this and also discusses Marty's truth. Essentially, the civic duty of culture critic is being able to look at American history and culture and criticizing this history, not just hiding from it. In his text, Which America is Ours, he includes Marty's truth in which he says, such criticisms of teaching American literature politically from a critical multicultural perspective rely on a false and inaccurate assessment of the current state of U.S. universities. This is the reality though. If you think about it, since most of these things particularly presented in this course were never taught to me, yet I found them so highly significant to the culture and identity of America. Then, James Garcia says, the United States is thus by definition a place constituted through increasingly extreme conflict and the inability to overcome it, which is such a harsh yet true statement. Because America ignores its past and the negatives that have occurred, we're still stuck in the same page today. Since so much history isn't considered or culturally criticized anymore, we're unable to overcome it. With this being said, James Garcia states, cultural critics should base the study of American literature on a more accurate, less celebratory vision. Think about it. We're always presented with information regarding the American dream, the amazing founding fathers, the amazing presidents in a celebratory vision. However, these people have all had flaws and have contributed to the racism in America. So why aren't we taught about this also? All in all, the civic duty of culture is having the American duty to learn the truth and express it in America. One is to criticize the history and identity of America in order to face the reality and be able to overcome it, which is something that should be taught in universities. Overall, it's our job to learn about this and be able to reflect and criticize what we think of America today. To answer your second question, Nick, Pfister informed us about surveyors of American literature. In his text, Critical Work and Critical Pleasure, Pfister describes American literature surveyors of customs as surveyors of how Americans have become accustomed to structures, processes, and relations that damage themselves or others. Moreover, he says he uses customs to present critical concerns. Essentially, surveyors of customs are able to show a side of American history and put readers into perspectives of what kind of experiences occurred throughout the time period. Surveyors of customs are also able to discuss the harm or crucial moments that they've lived through to inform future generations of the history taking place. I utilize these methods when reading about American literature throughout reading the text, but also writing. These 5 threshold concepts allow me to open my perspective in regards to the people, what time period they lived in, where they came from, how much education they had, and so on. These methods were highly beneficial due to the fact that I was able to critically think and analyze more, but also reflect way deeper in my writing. When reflecting, I'm able to reflect on how life is presented in the historical time period and to other authors, but also to today's generation and how America is perceived today. I took on the role of a culture critic by allowing myself to see more than one perspective when being presented with every source in this class. For example, I wasn't only focusing on my opinion on topics like slavery, the American Indian history, and such. I had to understand that the time periods were way different and slavery was definitely okay to leaders in America, as was segregation, simply because that superiority had existed for so long. When doing so, I'm able to criticize both utilizing the authors and their generation's perspectives, but also mine. This clearly gives me more space to openly reflect and criticize American culture and identity. Overall, the role of a culture critic gives me more of an understanding of what American identity consists of and why it's so important to be able to teach more material like this in schools. Along with this, it's significant to inform those around you whenever there's a chance and be knowledgeable about everything that takes place with American identity and focus on the thousands of flaws, not just the dreamy moments. When analyzing each primary text, I'm able to better criticize and understand authors and their generations due to my part of keeping an open mind and understanding the flaws that also exist in American history.
Thank you for that, Flora. I've actually learned about both Pfister and James Garcia in an English course I had this semester as well. I found their methods very useful for writing and reading the difficult material I was presented with. Finally, we have arrived at the last topic of our podcast. My question to you is, what 2 principal themes have been presented through the primary text that 1. Speak truth to power, and 2. Address diversity in American culture, identity, and values that economic and political elites labored to control through culture and law?
Thanks, Nick. I have written a lot of information for this section that you're going to ask me, so I'm going to elaborate on the different parts. So first, I'm going to elaborate on the 2 themes that came across all texts. The 2 principal themes that I found were 1. The cruel and unfortunate experiences people in America have lived through, specifically colored people, and 2. The American dream is a false sense of hope. So this speaks truth to power in the sense that first, Baldwin, Bulusan, Deloria, Caf, Paredes, Taylor, and Vargas all experienced unpleasant moments when moving and while living in the United States as minorities. Take into account Caf for one. She moved to the United States from Syria and was bullied her entire time in schools by Americans who viewed her as weird just for appearing different in the sense of dressing, speaking, how she looked, and so on. One can instantly get the sense that the diversity in America was such a problem due to the racism that has always been a part of this country's identity. When thinking about Bulusan, his book speaks about the American dream and his life as an American and how much he had worked. He talks about how he never gave up on the American dream because he believed he could get it. However, he was forced to work more than half the day for barely any pay, showing these cruel and unfortunate experiences. Minorities were always the ones working outdoors, given no water, making barely any money, and so much more. In The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin emphasizes on the differences between white people and black people in America. One thing that he says in his book that really stuck with me was, "You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity." This statement specifically stuck with me because it's so disappointing to see how worthless black people were in America since they were in the womb. It was against the law for black people to be educated, which all makes sense when we think about white supremacy. In his book, he also says that blacks were born into a society that consisted of brutal cruelty, and in every way possible, African Americans were worthless human beings. Similar to this, Susie King Taylor was an African American woman who shared her memoir of what it was like to be an African American woman in the Civil War. She shares her insight on her experiences of both things. This was rare, as not every woman was educated, nonetheless African Americans. She was the first to share a different perspective with her memoir. Her opportunity of being educated and being really impactful in America as a woman shows the sense of a different experience. However, she also wasn't treated the same way as white people because of her color, and although she was enlisted, she would never be treated the same because of her race. And again, she was born into slavery but let go because of her lucky slave owners. This emphasizes on the cruel and unfortunate experience they went through throughout their entire lives because of the fact that this was already planned out for their lives due to the color of their skin. Brutality and cruelty consisted of beating slaves, raping slaves and other people, separating black families, prohibiting education, and so much more. When we think about Paredes, Bulusan, and Vargas, we see how they were overworked in America due to the different races and how these people were treated. In Bulusan's novel, America is in the Heart, he speaks about his experiences of coming to America for the American dream. He worked under brutal conditions, under racism and discrimination, making the American dream much less of a reality. He mentions how he and his people were stopped each time by a patrolman, which really emphasizes racism again. He also explains how he lived a planless life, which I believe is because of so much work and how they were treated. Similarly, Paredes was born into the unfortunate times of World War I, lived through World War II, lived through the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, lived through the Great Depression, which made his family and himself suffer greatly from. He says how he experienced many of his family members and friends dropping out of school, which is clear was worse for people of color because they had already lacked education most of the time. His novel focuses on the mistreatment towards Mexican Americans, specifically on the struggles of a young American boy named Juanito. In his novel, one thing he says is, "Who the hell am I? Just a poor damn Mexican that's worth less than a dog in this cursed country," which was really influential. Again, this portrays the theme of cruelty and unfair experiences people of color had in America. Vargas also shares similar experiences when moving to America with his family for a better life. However, he does mention in his text that he realized that it's a different type of reality for people of color here in America. He knew what it was like to live in this country in fear of one day something happening to him, which was also similar to slaves. People of color were put in situations of brutality, cruelty, violence, discrimination, racism, and so much more. The American dream for colored people consists of being treated differently and forced to work under unsafe conditions, which is evident throughout the author's novels. Deloria, however, focuses on a different basis in We Talk, You Listen. He essentially is comparing black lives and their experience to those of Indians, which he believes Indians suffer more. He offers a different perspective of what it was like for Indians to live here and what they struggle with. They also experience violence and cruelty with separation, killing, racism, and so much more. This first theme also shows diversity in American literature, culture, identity, and values that economic and political elites have labored to control in the way that All of these surveyors experienced the differences in their lives and their labor. Take, for instance, Susie King Taylor and Baldwin. They experienced slavery and the labor that they had because of being slaves, while also getting an education. When talking about Paredes, Bulusan, and Vargas, they experienced exhausting labor outdoors with other Mexican Americans and different races. Deloria experienced the hardships Indians lived under, reservations, false promises, etc. Kath experienced racism and assumptions because of her race, religion, and how she dressed. Overall, all of these authors experienced diversity in the form of the mistreatment, cruelty, and racism they lived through. America's diversity in treating people of different color and America's way of underpaying these people also emphasizes on the economic and political elites under labor. All in all, the color of their skin comes to show every different race they had in culture. When thinking about the second theme of the falsity that exists in the phrase American Dream, that is also conveyed in all of the authors' writings. Baldwin and Susie King Taylor lived through slavery along with their families, which is mentioned in their novels. They were never exposed to freedom of full rights, which is a theme heavily emphasized on. The American dream to them never existed because they would never have the same opportunities as white people. Saying this, authors like Paredes, Bulusan, and Vargas also speak about how different Mexican Americans were treated and how their lives were different. They came here for a better life, but was it really a better life? Would you consider hard labor, racism, discrimination, and fear a better life? In their texts, they all express how the American dream was a false sense of hope because it felt like they had no life due to all the hard work for what they thought would be a better life. I suppose in regards to a little more money, it was, but not for the dreams truly. Taft, along with many other people with tangerine scarves around their head, are usually judged and assumed to be terrorists. So she never had a great idea of what it meant to live in the American dream. The attacks, judgment, cruel words all ruined this dream, as did with Calf in one way or another. Finally, it's clear how Deloria, as many other Indians, never experienced the American dream. Being taken away from their land, being raped and beaten, separated from their families, and so much more. How would whites feel if this happened? I'm sure they wouldn't be calling it the American dream either. Overall, all authors show a different side to America, which is the truth. The truth in American culture and identity, something that Americans are not used to telling, which is disappointing. These authors portrayed both these themes and descriptions of their lives in America, which is horrifying to learn about, but so important to know when it comes to describing American culture and identity.
Those are well-established themes, Flora, that I have to say make total sense to everything you've answered in our podcast. American identity is usually hidden or never spoken about, which is upsetting, but the reality we have been faced with. As Americans, it's our duty to know the truth behind America and be able to criticize, as Marty Truth says. We have to stop seeing America as a heroic place that doesn't consist of any faults, because that's completely false. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our podcast. Thank you for having me as your interviewer today. This was a very interesting discussion to have, as most of this information is not usually learned about.
Thank you for serving as my interviewer, Nick. Yes, sadly these topics have been essentially forgotten or are just too sensitive to talk about in schools, which I don't agree with. I thank you for your input in this discussion and I hope to meet with you again soon. That is it for today's podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the intense conversation we had going on. I invite you to tune in to my next podcast that will be available a week from now. We'll be discussing United States history previous to the year 1860. Again, thank you for being here with us. Until next time, thank you.